This video is brought to you by Skillshare. South Korea is often presented by Western media as a sort of democratic ideal. It's been one of the fastest growing economies in history, with a GDP per capita today higher than many countries in Europe, and it became the envy of the democratic world during the pandemic, when its rapid and effective testing system allowed it to escape the first wave without restrictive lockdowns. However, inside South Korea, the perception is quite different. The two main parties have been beset by scandal and infighting, and incumbent President Yoon Suk-yeol has one of the lowest approval ratings in the world. So in this video, we're going to have a look at South Korea's economic miracle, how it became a democracy, and what's gone wrong recently. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a bit of context, because the story of South Korea's post-war development is really quite remarkable. In the 50s, after the Korean War, South Korea was appallingly poor. The war had devastated its economy, and GDP per capita was about $1,000, making it the poorest country in the region. South Korea had a brief flirtation with democracy in 1960, but in 1961 the government was overthrown by a military coup led by General Park Chung-hee. Park was undeniably a bit of an autocrat, imprisoning dissenters while banning everything from certain types of clothing to certain types of music. But he wasn't necessarily anti-democratic. Instead, he argued that democracy only really worked with a functioning economy. And, well, to be fair to him, Park was undeniably good at managing South Korea's economy. In part inspired by Germany's impressive post-war growth, known as the Miracle on the Rhine, Park set up a manufacturing and export-led economic system, where heavy industries like petrochemicals, steel and shipbuilding were actively supported by the government. In part because South Korea's super cheap labour costs kept South Korean exports competitive, the South Korean economy started to grow at about 7% a year in the early 60s. Park also began repairing relations with Japan, culminating in a normalization treaty in 1965, and supported America during the Vietnam War, who returned the favour by sending hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign aid to South Korea. The Americans successfully pressured Park into holding elections in 1963 by threatening to withdraw aid after Park announced his intention to continue with military rule for another 4 years. But Park won the election anyway. Under Park's stewardship, the South Korean economy continued its rapid growth for the next 15 years or so, growing at an average rate of about 10% until 1980, and Park was re-elected in 1967 and 1971. South Korea's GDP per capita essentially quadrupled between 1960 and 1980, and commentators started talking about the miracle on the Han to describe South Korea. Park was assassinated in 1979, but successive South Korean governments continued his export-led economic program, and South Korea continued to grow rapidly, reaching a GDP per capita of around $17,000 by the end of the 20th century. What makes South Korea's economic story even more impressive is that it avoided the so-called middle-income trap. Essentially, many developing countries have been able to stimulate rapid economic growth by focusing on manufacturing and exports, but they often get stuck at a GDP per capita of about $15,000, because as wages rise, their exports get less competitive and they struggle to develop their high-value industries. South Korea was able to maintain its rapid growth into the 21st century by nurturing its technology sector and reorienting its manufacturing sector towards more advanced manufacturers like electronics and semiconductors. Today, South Korea has a GDP per capita of nearly $34,000, making it one of the wealthiest countries not just in the region, but in the world. For context, that's higher than Spain and Italy, and only a bit lower than France. As Park predicted, economic development eventually paved the way for democracy, and South Korea became what we might describe as a proper democracy in 1988, after massive pro-democracy protests forced the government to move away from the de facto one-party system. A new two-party system quickly emerged, dominated by the Liberal Democratic Party of Korea, or DPK, and the Conservative People Power Party, or PPP. While this new system worked for a while, in the past few years, ordinary South Koreans have become increasingly disillusioned with both parties. Since about 2016, South Korea's political class has been beset by a stream of controversies, often related to their overly friendly links to South Korea's corporate dynasties. There was some hope that last year's election of the PPP's Yoon Suk-yeol, a former prosecutor general, would mark a turning point, but this hasn't happened. Yoon has been a divisive president, picking fights with not just the opposition, but also with factions within his own party. Despite promising big tent government, Yoon has marginalised other figures within his party and refused to cooperate with the DPK, who have a majority in South Korea's legislative chamber. The opposition have blocked Yoon's proposed labour and education reforms, and Yoon has responded by vetoing basically any big bill that the opposition gets through the legislature. The two sides have also clashed over Yoon's pro-America foreign policy, which critics claim is escalating geopolitical tensions and sacrificing South Korea's interests. The two parties now spend most of the time fighting each other. Earlier this year, Yoon began investigations into corruption allegations surrounding the DPK's leader and his connections to a scandal-ridden development project and illegal cash remittances to North Korea. And in retaliation, the DPK called for investigations into Yoon's wife, who hit the headlines last year for allegedly plagiarizing some of her academic work and manipulating stock prices. The two parties took things up a notch last week, when the DPK-controlled legislature passed a motion urging Yoon to sack his prime minister for incompetence, which Yoon ignored, and the government approved an arrest warrant for the DPK leader. This infighting and partisan deadlock has prevented the government from actually addressing the various crises affecting South Korea, in part because South Korea has the lowest fertility rate in the world. Its economy has slowed and public finances are showing signs of strain. There are echoes of what happened to Japan in the 90s. Houses are unaffordably expensive, having doubled in price since 2008, and household debt is now over 100% of GDP, compared with 58% in Germany and 79% in America. South Korea is also suffering from a youth unemployment crisis, especially amongst graduates, and in 2020, the IMF warned that South Korea was one crisis away from a Japan-style recession. Unsurprisingly, South Koreans aren't happy. Yoon has one of the lowest approval ratings in the world, and both the government and opposition have approval ratings below 35%. Unfortunately for South Koreans, this partisan deadlock shows no sign of abating, and ordinary voters are becoming increasingly apathetic towards their democracy and its two-party duopoly. Across the developed world, many establishment parties are struggling to deal with the economic challenges. But in South Korea, the problem is particularly acute because voters don't really have any alternatives. Things are expected to change with a story like this, so make sure you stay on top of updates. That way you know what's going on, and let's be honest, it always feels great to stay on top of things. Even within TLDR, a few of us have been brushing up our InDesign skills in order to create the newspaper we're currently working on. It turns out that making a professional-looking newspaper is pretty difficult, so we headed to Skillshare to take their course on the topic. Unlike when I tried to learn InDesign for another never-released project a few years ago, this time I was guided through the process quickly and effectively, and this time the project will actually see the light of day thanks to Skillshare's incredibly easy-to-follow guides. It's not just that either. You likely already knew Skillshare for classes on things like photography, editing and illustration, but Skillshare also has hundreds of career-focused classes too. We all know at this stage that traditional jobs aren't one size fits all. I mean, I finished university and came straight into a job at a YouTube channel. That's not necessarily the path that you want to take, but the courses on Skillshare can help you design a career to fit you. There's courses on everything from how to start a business to maximising your workflow or how to grow in e-commerce. Another course that Jack's actually taking to help with the newspaper project. And if you use our link, you can get access to all of that for free. That's right, the first 1,000 people to use the link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare.